Hello, everybody. This is Lisa, your host of Unexplained America, and thank you for joining me this week. So, this is part 3 of Richard Ramirez, The Night Stalker. This has been long, and I'm ready to just put this to bed. I'll just tell you. Quick business before we get started. So, thank you guys so much for listening to part 1 and 2. Please look in the show notes for all the way to contact me. I'm on all the social medias, so go check me out. And please leave a comment, leave me a 5-star rating, just whatever you wish, okay? And share with friends. Kind of where we left off in part 2 was basically part 1 was like really big dive into Richard's life. Part 2 covered all of the horrendous events, like all of the murder events, all the assault events that Richard committed and then we ended at the time that he was arrested, which was August 31st of 1985. So that is where I'm picking up. So bear with me. We're going to start there and go to the finish line, okay? Just the end of his life, period, okay? So, I hope you have enjoyed the deep dives. It's been a lot, and I'll just tell you, I'm ready to never think about Richard Ramirez ever again, myself. On August 31st, 1985, Gil and Frank, okay, the detectives, they were working with all the other teams of detectives that were, dispersed that morning that were looking for Richard, okay? So they heard kind of every movement going on and the capture of Richard via the police radio. So they're listening in. So they are elated. Like, of course, they're like amazing. So by 10:10 that morning, they head to the LAPD station where Richard was taken, okay? And there has already gathered a bunch of angry people, a bunch of angry citizens, and then a lot of reporters. So they were told that he was wanting to talk whenever they got there. So they were told that. Now, by the time that they did get there, he had already told the police about a black bag that was stashed at the Greyhound terminal that he said had guns in it. Now, upon meeting Frank, Richard said he knew him. He said, "You brought down Bianchi and Buono," meaning the Hillside Stranglers. Frank recalled kind of a chill going through him. Richard kind of knowing who he was just bothered him. It was just creepy. Now, initially, Richard did ask for an attorney after they read him his rights, but then they rose to kind of leave. They're like, okay, if you ask for his attorney, you don't want to talk. So they go to leave, and then he said that he would talk, but not about the murders. Frank and Gil sit back down. Richard was calm. He was shy. He kind of kept his head down. Gil went to speak to him in Spanish and kind of asked him questions about his family and stuff. And he would state Richard told him about Julian hitting him as he grew up, hitting him and his brothers. Now, by 10:40 a.m., Richard was pretty much done chatting. Like, the interview ended. He wouldn't talk anymore to Gil or anything. So they went ahead and booked him into the county jail. Now, crowds of people, like I said, had gathered. They're angry. They're yelling, "Give him to us." The Mayor Bradley, the mayor of LA, came on. His name was Mayor Bradley. He comes through to congratulate everyone. He announces, to press that California can breathe a sigh of relief. A very dangerous man is off the streets. Like, this was celebration. Like, everyone was elated. Because of all the fear and such, the angry crowds, they were gathered. They literally used 4 cars, 8 motorcycle cops, and 1 helicopter to transfer Richard. Now, this is transferring him from the police station to the county jail to book him. They didn't want anything bad to happen to him, obviously, because there was so much going on. They definitely wanted to see him prosecuted. So during the transfer, throngs of people are gathered. They're screaming at Richard. He was sandwiched between Frank and another detective, the Orozco. Now, while some people screamed at Richard, one woman decided to raise her shirt and flash it. Now, Gil would state later that that was for Richard, but some of the detectives thought at the time that that was for their benefit, like as in a thank you. Either way, this ridiculous behavior was really a start to what you'll see, just the craziness surrounding this case and Richard and everything. Now they get Richard showered, jumpsuited. He enters his cell. He proceeds to pace. Like, he paces like a wounded animal. He cannot stay still. Now, meanwhile, Frank and Gil, after kind of waiting on the proper warrants, they're able to open Richard's black bag. So the bag contained a jar of Vaseline, a black pair of Stadia sneakers. I've never heard of those. A bottle of vitamins, a pair of brown gardening gloves. There were long-nosed pliers. There were locking pliers. There were 2 sets of keys. There was a 32 and a 20 revolver. And then there was a box of ammunition for 25 and 22 caliber gun. There was a pair of sunglasses and then a can of Weight On. And there was also an AC adapter in this bag. The bag ticket was in the name of a Greg Ramirez, and the address used was actually Rubens. The bag, again, this was the bag that Richard said was stashed at the Greyhound station. Now, they bag and tag every single item in this bag, and all of it is entered as evidence. Now, the lab was able to match the bullet shells with those found at the crime scenes. The prosecution was happy. Now, the prosecutor assigned was a Phil Halpin. Phil had an excellent history and reputation. He was super fierce. He was a really good trial lawyer. He was one of the finest in the office at the time. Now, he had been literally co-counsel on the Charles Manson case. Yes. And he was famous for kind of prosecuting what was called the Onion Field murder case, which was a case I did not know about. It was a case in 1963 where 2 policemen were actually taken and shot and left in like an onion field near Bakersfield. So he prosecuted that murderer. And so he just had a good reputation. He had a good name. He was very, very good at his job. Now, Halpin would be looking to send Richard to the gas chamber. Like, he is looking for the death penalty. And he felt his crimes reflected way too much planning for any type of successful insanity defense, which is what he was kind of thinking that they would go, down that road. Now, he stated he had never encountered a more vicious murderer than Richard Ramirez. And again, this is a man that was co-counsel for Charles Manson, is saying, like, huge. That's huge. Now, Richard's arraignment hearing, that's scheduled for Tuesday, September 3rd, 1985. Now, the police scheduled a lineup, which is going to be held at noon on, September 5th. And this lineup was for, the surviving victims to come and, see Richard in a lineup and identify him, but it was also to view all the stolen items that they had, confiscated the cops had, because the cops wanted to match up these items to whom they were. Now, Detective Ulof and Olson, so they were sent actually to Ruben's house, Richard's brother Ruben. Now, Jesse Perez had told the police that Richard had a 1976 green Pontiac, and the police wanted to find it. So Ruben took the police to the vehicle, which was in Lincoln Park. After proper warrant, the car was investigated, and Richard's prints were found in it. They found some handcuffs, and they found a pentagram was etched in the dashboard, tying things together now. Now, the news of Richard's arrest as the Valley Intruder, he was also, called the Walk-In Killer, and then, of course, the Night Stalker. This went national and then obviously hit El Paso, Texas, where he's from. And this was hitting right away. And, of course, so El Paso, they had already had on the news, even before Richard was caught. Remember, they released his name. And so all of this news was hitting Richard's family. So Ruth is in shock, disbelief. Julian and Mercedes, they're horrified and inconsolable. The kids are trying to console the parents there. It's just, everyone's in the family is just thinking, well, how could he be? How could this happen? It must be a mistake. So Julian, literally, upon finding out, threatens to kill Mercedes and then kill himself. He is so full of shame. He couldn't bear the shame, but the kids came in, like Ruth and Joseph, and they take away his guns and remove the guns from the house and calm them down, give them some sedatives so they'll just sleep. The parents are just grief-stricken about all of this. Of course, on top of this, the news, the media, is all over the place. And of course, this is upon really releasing Richard's name, even before the 31st. We're talking, they released his name like the 30th. It was all just really fast, but the media was everywhere around their home. So, they were just hiding. The family was hiding. And they didn't know what to do. Ruth didn't know what to do. So she decided she would go to LA to meet up with Reuben. And then Nancy, remember, she was Richard's actual girlfriend. So she had heard about all this, and she had come to the family home to be with them, to console them. So she decided to actually travel with Ruth to LA to just accompany her. She also could not believe that Richard could be guilty. This is not the man that she knew. That's not how Richard was with her. Richard, right away, he is assigned a public defender. His name is Alan Adashek. Now, Adashek meets Richard. He advises him to plead not guilty. Ruth gets to Richard, and he tells her he's not the Night Stalker. He denies any part of that. But he also states that he's not going to get a fair trial. He might as well plead guilty. That's what he's telling Ruth. So she is crying for him to fight for his innocence. He's saying he's innocent. She wants him to fight for it. So Ruth said she would find him an attorney because he's not happy about this public defender, Alan, that has been assigned. Richard thanks Ruth and Nancy for coming. He tells Ruth he loves her. He blows them kisses and sees them off. By September 3rd, Richard shackled. He is in another convoy and a helicopter, just a whole thing to get him from the jail to the courthouse for his arraignment. So he's hiding his face from the photographers, and he does notice the huge presence there. And he is just hiding from the cameras. A judge, Elva Soper, is assigned for this part. And this is really weird to me. It's like there's different judges per this different ordeal, and we'll go through this. But a judge, Elva Soper, is assigned originally. The courthouse is packed. This is just for his arraignment. Reporters, police, onlookers, and also there is already an assortment of females that have seen Richard in the news, and they want to get a better look at him, and they think that he is attractive. Hadashek, Alan does, so he advises Richard at this time, plead not guilty, and that there was already film producers calling and wanting rights to his story. So Alan is telling him this. Richard does not want any part of this. He is like, I do not want a long drawn out trial. He is stating he wants to plead guilty from the very beginning. He wants to plead guilty. In the courtroom, again, Richard hides his face in his hands. His face is lower. He's not really looking up. At this hearing, Prosecutor Halpin, he says the current charges filed at this point, so this is like right away, was on Bill Doy, and then the rape, like the murder of Bill Doy, and then the rape of Lillian, and then the robbery of Clara Hadsel, and then he just states there are many charges pending, especially after, obviously, they're still working on this lineup. These are just the charges that they have at this point, if that makes sense. Like, obviously, they don't have everything together. There's multiple victims. There's so much to go through. So far, this is what they have. Now, Judge Soper, who was a very fierce female judge, kind of ahead of her time, so she states right away, no bail, not an option, like too heinous a crime, and that the next hearing wouldn't be until September 9th. Richard leaves the courtroom, still hiding his head. Back in his cell, he receives all his mail, and he is finding that he is already receiving like fan mail. Ladies have written to him, and then again, others like Satanists have written to him. Church of Satan people, like they're already reaching out to him. They're professing their support. So he's getting all this quote unquote fan mail already. The city of Los Angeles, of course, everybody is still, they're celebrating, but they have lived in fear for months. It's just been an ordeal. So they have like an award ceremony and they present plaques to like the brave citizens on Hubbard Street who brought, Richard down. So they're just celebrating. And now I will say not everyone supported Richard's captors. There was a 25-year-old college graduate that was working as an editor for a magazine, and her name was Doreen. She's going to come up a lot, but she was watching all this. She sees Richard's bandaged face, and she vows to protect Richard and help him out. Yeah, so you have that. So on the 4th, so this was September 4th, 2 LA County detectives, they meet up with 6 other detectives in El Paso, and they have a search warrant to go through Ruth's house and then Julian's house. Okay, so Jesse had said Richard would mail items home, like to Ruth, and so the search warrant was to cover items like they were looking for knives, bloody clothes, binoculars, guns, bullets, handcuffs, VCRs, shoes, videos or photos of the murders, satanic paraphernalia, and a pair of brown eyes. They're still looking for Maxine's eyes. So Ruth and Julian were again just shocked and confused. And of course, you have poor Julian and Mercedes. They don't speak English, but there's typically I think they had a translator there, and then Ruth would help them to understand or whatever. But they don't understand. They're already really upset, but they act very respectful of the police. They don't fight anything. I mean, they're just in shock. The police take all the jewelry and then some knives from Ruth's house. Now, when they get to Julian's, they find Julian so upset, so distraught. Mercedes has literally taken to the bed and she's under doctor's care. So the police actually do not do a full search of Julian and Mercedes' home. And for the most part, according to even Ruth, that, he would send items to Ruth, but Ruth had said nothing went to Julian and Mercedes. So they didn't get searched. Now on September 5th, again, they had this lineup planned. All the victims, they arrive in this auditorium for the lineup, and you have Nettie and Claire Hadsel. They can't attend. They are still under doctor's, care. Nettie, of course, was in a bad way even before what happened, to her before she was beaten. So some victims, like Virginia and Chris Pearson, so they show up. They are bandaged, moving slow. Most of the victims have nurses assisting them. A lot of these people, even though they survived Richard, I mean, and we'll talk about this, they will have lifelong issues. Now, Richard, against his wishes, is in the lineup. They put 5 other men of kind of similar height, weight, looks. They were all put on a stage in this auditorium. Now, Richard is number 2 in the lineup, and he still had evidence of his own head trauma. Again, there was they had to shave a little part of his head and his injuries, and so he was mad, period, but he was mad that they were already conducting this lineup instead of waiting for his head to heal for him to be 100%. Again, once he gets up there, people are having to see him. There are gasps and tears. All the victims are just at the sight of Richard. I mean, just a gasp. He and the other men are made to say, "Don't look at me, bitch, or I'll kill you," because that was the most common statement, from the Night Stalker. Now, there were so many victims, they had to do the lineup twice, 2 different lineups, and there's just so many people to point out. So it said that nearly all the victims listed number 2 as who they saw assaulted them. Next, the victims or their family members, especially, obviously, there were a lot of the victims that were killed, so their family members had to be there. So they're led to a room where all the recovered stolen items, and again, this was mainly jewelry, were all displayed, and there were over 2,000 items displayed. 2,000. Now, Ma Bell's son, David, so he shows up and he does identify the cassette player he had actually given to his mom. And Carol Kyle, remember her and her, Richard came in and it was her and her son, but she identifies her necklace with that teardrop diamond. So she does identify that. Now, Samkid Kanoneth, Sakina Abawith, the Doy's daughter Linda. So all of them identify items that were their family members. Now, Adishek gives an interview to the LA Times that day stating the effect of all of this massive publicity can be very negative in terms of a fair trial. So he's already talking to the press. Now, Ruth and Robert, they visit Richard, and he keeps reiterating his innocence to his family and complains about Adishek, and he complains that the guards are drugging him and he's having severe migraines. He will continually discuss how he believes the guards are drugging him, and he believes they're drugging him through his food. Yes, and this goes on for quite a while. They do bring Reuben with him as well, and they discuss the cops' focus on the pentagram in the Pontiac and matching the crime scene pentagram. So Richard is kind of dismissing this. He just says it's nonsense, and the family, they just believe Richard. They're just believing that he's innocent. Now, meanwhile, Emmanuel Barraza, so he is an attorney in El Paso. He has contacted the family, and he meets up with Julian and the family to offer his services pro bono. But again, he's in El Paso. Now, September 9th, Richard is back in court. He is completely different already from where he was when he first came to court, like on the 3rd. He is staring defiantly at everyone. He grunts at Prosecutor Halpin. Yeah, he's completely different. Like, he is no longer hanging his head down. Now, Adishek requests more time to review all the police reports and that they're not ready for a plea. So the next date is scheduled for September 13th. He also asked for a gag order on the public officials discussing Richard's guilt because obviously, the city is celebrating. The judge says she'll look at this. Now, Halpin requests a plaster cast and photographs of Richard's teeth. Obviously, the victims have described the teeth. They're very important. And Halpin was worried that the teeth would change with possible tooth loss and or jailhouse fight. The judge concedes. Now, Manuel is talking a lot to the press. He's talking about how it's going to be difficult for Richard to get a fair trial, that there's no evidence that he committed the crimes, and that he's going to get the trial moved. And he's even boasting how he can get it moved out of California, which is obviously, to say the least. Now, Manuel meets with Richard, and they hit it off, but Manuel is, obviously, he is not certified, he is not sworn in to practice law in California. He can only practice law in Texas. So the family sets up for a California attorney named Melvin Belly to meet. So he, nobody else wanted the case. The family initially reached out to several attorneys and no one wanted to talk to them. No one wanted to be associated. Now, Melvin was actually more of a, I believe he specialized in divorce work. I mean, he wasn't even a criminal attorney, but he had mentioned that he would meet with them. Now, a Dr. Gerald Vale, so he was the lead forensic dentist. So he goes to the jail and he gets the plaster cast done. He takes photos of Richard's teeth and then x-rays on Richard's teeth. Ruth, of course, she's working very hard. She just believes in Richard's innocence and she is just going to help Richard all she can. So Ruth sets up a meeting with a Daniel Hernandez and his colleague Arturo Hernandez. Now, they are not related. They just have the same last name. So this will get, I'll call them Daniel and Arturo, by the way, because it just gets confusing otherwise. But they were attorneys in California and they were possibly interested. Richard is continually stating that he just wants to plead guilty. He just wants to plead guilty to make it simple. And he states that he's not going to get a fair trial, that he's just going to get convicted anyway. And he wants to make things simple for his parents. A new court date is pushed out. So remember, it was September 13th. Well, now it's not going to be until September 27th. Now, Belly, that attorney, he meets with Ruth and Richard on the 17th. So like Manuel, he found Richard to be gentle and intelligent and all this, and Richard stated he just wanted to plead guilty. Belly said he couldn't do a full trial. He just did not have the time. But if Richard just wanted to plead guilty, and then he would be able to help with that. So at this meeting on the 17th, he's saying, okay, if you're just pleading guilty, I will help you bargain that. However, literally by the 18th, Belly had called Ruth and declined getting involved completely. So he was out. He's just saying, no, I can't do it. I think he thought about it and was like, no. He mentioned to Ruth the only way he would was with a full mental health workup on Richard. And then he talked about how expensive that was. And obviously, they don't have any money. And this is kind of being, said on the front end like, hey, we don't have any money to pay you. We just need help. Now, fortunately for Richard, a criminal attorney of 22 years named Joseph Gallegos, he comes forward and he calls the public defender's office and he offers his services. Now, Adishek Adishek at first, he wanted this case. This case was it was a big deal. Like, he wanted it for, his career. He wanted it for personal reasons. But by now, he knows that Richard's not going to work with him. And I think he's probably seen that Richard's not going to be easy to work with. So he knows Richard doesn't want to use him. So he tells Richard about Joseph calling in. Now, on the morning of the 27th of September, so the district attorney's office, they, announce a press conference to state the new charges. So, of course, you only had the Dewey charges at first. So now there's going to be new charges. Now, Frank and Gil, they're with prosecution Halpin. So there were 14 new murder charges and 45 other felony counts added, which included rape, sodomy, abduction, assault, and robbery. So these were there was also a child molestation charge in there as well, which we'll discuss. Richard is continuing to tell Adishek he just wants to plead guilty to all of these charges. Adishek requests a meeting with the judge and prosecution Halpin. So he's like, hey, Richard's wanting to just plead guilty. So he tells them that Richard shouldn't be in court. He wasn't in his right mind, just wants to plead guilty. The judge agrees for the defense and has Richard in a holding pen so that he can hear court but not be a part, because Richard is refusing to come to court even. Now, when Richard, finds out about the delays that Adishek is just saying that he's not in his right mind, so to speak, he is in that room, to himself, and he is cursing and he is yelling for Belly, like the attorney. Now, the courtroom is full of press. There were even international media there, like specifically from the Spanish-speaking countries. Now, Ruth is there. She is there for these proceedings. So Ruth is there hiding in dark glasses, and she is not surprised because she knew, what Richard was wanting, just to plead guilty. Now, Halpin presents an 84-page complaint with all the new charges, and Adishek requests 3-week push on just the plea hearing. Again, we're in the plea hearing stage. A new court date is set as October 9th. Now, Manuel Barraza, he has Richard sign the rights to his story over to Ruth. And then that way Ruth can sign it over, because what they're thinking is that Richard's story is going to be worth money, and Richard's not going to be able to have any money made on his name, but that they're going to need leverage to pay attorneys in the future, kind of thing. So that's what he expresses to do. Now, the Hernandez, they want to meet and represent him. And so they set up a meeting date that's supposed to be Richard meeting the Hernandez that Ruth wants him to meet, and then this Joseph Gallegos. And then Richard's supposed to make a decision. So Richard first meets with Gallegos, and he automatically agrees for him to represent him. Now, Gallegos, even though he hadn't even met the Hernandez. Now, Gallegos professes to Richard that he was arrested in 1975 for shooting a sex worker, and that the press might bring it up. And he does, so he is honest about this situation. And he does advise Richard that he should file an insanity plea, but Richard refuses. October 9th comes, all the parties meet in a closed meeting about Attashek being removed and Galagos being assigned. So everybody meets on this, and like with the judge and with Richard and Halpin. They all agree on this. However, by October 22nd, they're all back in court. Now, Richard was wanting the Hernandez, Arturo, and Daniel to represent him by this time. So the press had released all that bad backstory on Galagos, and so Richard did not want him. Of course, Ruth did not want him, and Ruth had wanted the Hernandez. Ruth was able to talk Richard into the Hernandez, and now that's what they wanted. Now, in what started in a closed meeting, then moved to open court, and Judge Soper, she voices her concerns now about the Hernandez. Evidently, for one thing, the Hernandez were not very experienced. They had even had any involvement in like a criminal case, or like at least a murder case. And evidently they had contempt charges already filed against them in another county. Basically, they had been in contempt of court already. So they had a reputation, and they didn't even have, like, between them, they did not have a very long law experience. Like, they were very fresh. Like, I believe it was like maybe 2 years for one and 5 years for the other. So they didn't have the experience. They already kind of had a bad reputation of being held in contempt of court. And so Judge Soper was, not thrilled. So it was only literally 5 years experience, and they just hadn't handled a criminal case. So Halpin was also not thrilled about this because he felt their inexperience would slow down all kinds of stuff, would slow down the progress, and then it would just be bad. But Richard was adamant about using the Hernandez. And the Hernandez were kind of telling the family and telling Richard, hey, we will get you off. We will get you off as innocent. Like, they were just telling him that. So they stated the evidence was circumstantial. Now, this time when they went back to court, Mercedes was there. Now, poor Mercedes, and of course they're all wanting to, I say poor Mercedes, I do feel for the family, but there will be many people that do not feel for the family. So now this time, Mercedes is in court. And of course, the family is 100% behind Richard, but they are also fully saddened by all of it altogether. But she is dressed in full mourning wear, like a veil and all, like fully covered in black from head to toe. Now, likewise, other than the family, there are a lot of young women in the courthouse, and a lot of them were wearing black, and some of them were even carrying signs that said stuff like, I love Richard. Yes. This blows my mind. I know this happens like all the time. Of course, all these like women love Ted Bundy or whatever. I'm like, that is gross. October 24th, court resumes. Frank and Gil, they're present. Richard's siblings, and then around 12 of what they would call, not what Richard called them, but Richard's groupies. So there were about 12 of these groupies, and the bailiffs are watching these groupies very closely. So this is the same courthouse where the Manson trial happened, where the Manson followers were, and the bailiffs remember this. I mean, it's weird to me to think about. So this is 1985. I mean, the Manson murders were in 69. I mean, this is very kind of fresh. They are very looking at these women, and they remember that the Manson women did all kinds of things. Now, Judge Soper, against her own wishes and feelings, she does grant the Hernandez to be Richard's counsel, even though their payment was just rights to the book and movie deals. So, like, normally the defendant doesn't have money if they choose an attorney. Like, if they choose someone outside of the public defender's office, like, and obviously he's doing, they can pay, the state can pay. There's like a pay wage that they can pay this attorney. Well, in this case, the Hernandez, they weren't meeting the criteria to even be allowed to be the attorneys, bottom line. This is just because Richard wanted this. And basically, Richard has said, okay, you have rights to any monies off of book and movie deals. That's what their pay would be, because basically they're going to work for free. So Richard also refused, because the judge had wanted Richard to meet with a state-appointed attorney to at least discuss his rights about the pain, situation, about signing away the book and movie deals. He refused to even meet with that attorney. He is just refusing. He is being very difficult. He does not want to he's not doing anything that's recommended, by the way. So at this time in court, Richard stands up in the middle of court and reveals a pentagram on his palm and the numbers written 666. Everyone is stunned. Ruth is sitting there disappointed. The courtroom, they have to settle back down. So Hernandez asks for kind of a moment to settle down and then also to review the charges. Richard, on top of all that, yells out, "Hail Satan." This is kind of what's going on in the courtroom. It is just total chaos. Now, the Hernandez and Richard, they meet. They tell Richard the lineup was unfair. He tells them he never told, the police about the black bag voluntarily, like he takes that back. And they again are telling him that they can win. He agrees. I mean, up to this point, Richard has been very, very staunch on pleading guilty. They do change his mind. They do tell him to plead not guilty. So he's, okay, I'll plead not guilty. Now, back in the courtroom, he pleads not guilty, and the courtroom just erupts in just surprise, and just this is just, a lot is going on. Ruth is happy. So Ruth is happy because she was fighting for him to, quote unquote, fight for himself because she thinks he's innocent. So Judge Soper sets a preliminary hearing for December 13th. And this would be under a Judge Nelson. So now you've got another judge coming aboard. Judge Soper was basically for the original plea. Back to Doreen, remember her? So Doreen is meanwhile sending letters to the newspaper about Richard being treated unfairly. And after a series of kind of setbacks and pushbacks, all or most on the defense side of things, so that December hearing finally happens, but it doesn't happen until like March. So what was supposed to happen in December is now pushed to March, okay? So now on Monday, March 3rd, 1986, Halpin plans to call a total of 140 witnesses. However, for just this hearing, he is not going to call that many. He is not going to show like his whole case. Meanwhile, the Hernandez plan to get evidence thrown out and the lineup thrown out. That's what they're trying to do. And they're complaining about the prosecution being slow to release fingerprint reports to them, police and lab reports to them. At the hearing, Ruth and Reuben, they are seated in the back. Again, the other people there in the courthouses, the dozen groupies that are there, and they're sitting right as close to Richard as possible. And then there's Gil and Frank, who are sitting with the prosecution, and then there's tons of the media. So it's a packed courthouse. Now the Hernandez, they request the tape conversation with detectives to be thrown out, also the evidence in the black bag to be thrown out, and the evidence of Richard's Pontiac. Since Richard had requested an attorney at the initial meeting, they shouldn't have, he stated that they shouldn't have talked to him. Now, Judge Nelson said he'd defer the decision, so he's going to think on it. Halpin called numerous Night Stalker survivors and criminalists for this preliminary hearing. Now, Judge Nelson rules against the defense request and allows the evidence from the black bag and the Pontiac, and then also items from Ruth's house. Basically, he's saying, no, we're not going to dismiss any of this that you've requested. Now, Richard had separate charges filed from Orange County, but they would be dealt with after the LA County charges. So basically that would come later. Now, Richard was busy in jail with his female letter writers, plus Again, he did have the Satanist. He had that LaVey's daughter and a Marquis de Sade. They would actually visit him and correspond with him. So he had a lot of correspondence going on. Now, Halpin has Ruth and Reuben removed from the trial because he states they will be witnesses. So Ruth just goes back to El Paso. So she had been coming in, every day. This is now March. She had been pretty much coming August to March to be there, to be present for Richard as support. So she goes back home since she's not going to be admitted into the courthouse anyway. So now on Wednesday, April 16th, now Sheriff Deputy Ulof takes the stand and describes the day that they found the Cesares, and he describes Maxine's eyes missing, and literally at this, Richard laughs, like a high-pitched hyena laugh, like out loud. Ulof stops, of course, in his testimony and glares at him, and then the bailiffs, approach Richard, and they visibly, from the very beginning, they do not like Richard. Like, I think, again, like we've mentioned, like, these people were around for the whole Charles Manson bit. So they've seen bad things, bad people, and they're like, this is not good. So Ulof continues describing just the horrific, mutilations to Maxine. And then Richard just sits there with a grin, and he just looks at the crime scene photos while like grinning, like it's no big deal. So Halpin had to give the crime scene photos to the defense. Richard gets to see these, but he is just enjoying looking at them, basically. Now, Ulof continues to go over the evidence found at the scene. On cross-examination, the defense brings up that Peter Zozara had mentioned that possible mafia ties could be responsible for his parents' death, which they had already argued about this in front of the judge, like preliminary. So the judge shuts down any type of questions the Hernandez raise about the mafia. Now, Maria Hernandez, Carol Kyle, Whitney Bennett, Sophie Dickman, Samkid Kavananith, Sakina Abowith, and then Virginia Peterson, Jesse Perez, and Felipe Solano, they all testify. Now, Samkid's testimony was heart-wrenching. She sobbed and shook as she described, being cursed at, her hair pulled, being beaten. And during this testimony, Richard continued to be just vile. He would smile, he would laugh, he would scoff, swagger. Then to see his groupies with the smiles at him and the tight shorts and outfits was also repulsive to the jailer. So the whole court is repulsed by Richard and his groupies, and just the whole, there's no professionalism, there's no remorse, there's no nothing. Like, yeah, absolutely repulsive. Now the bailiffs, seeing that Richard is turning around repeatedly, talking to his groupies, they go and like try to manually make him look forward, like make him pay attention in court, and he screams for them to get their effing hands off of him. Then he and the bailiff, he fights the bailiff. They grapple, they fight. He is removed from the courtroom. Now, Arturo it's just such a drama. He goes and is pounding on the door to where Richard is, and he's looking through this keyhole, and he is saying, yelling, stop hitting him, like they're still hitting Richard. Stop hitting Richard. So Halpin, at this time, he jumps in and says to Arturo, why don't you go in there and stop them? So then there is almost a fight between Arturo and Halpin, and Gil and Frank have to jump in between them to calm them down. Once everybody's calmed down, once all calmed down, Richard comes back to court. He is brought back in eventually, and he is just grinning ear to ear. He does have a huge whelp on his neck. Now, Arturo complains about the bailiff, and the judge goes ahead and moves this bailiff from the courtroom. So just kind of to calm everything down. Now, a sheriff deputy named Jim Ellis is called to the chambers about statements Richard has said in custody at the jail. Richard is making statements. Judge Nelson says they're admissible because Richard was by now Mirandized and under legal counsel. So Ellis heard, so he gets on the stand, he tells that he had heard Richard say he had killed 20 people. One woman, he took her eyes, and how he shot a couple in San Francisco, which would be, the Pans. Now, Halpin, he rests after all of this is gone through. The Hernandez state that they're not going to call any witnesses at the hearing. So they're not calling anybody. Halpin did ask to drop 18 counts at that. So there were like 3 abduction molestation cases and then the robbery of Clara Hatzel. So Clara had actually died, and then the families of the little girls didn't want them to be re-traumatized. So they dropped those charges. And we'll bring that up kind of a little bit later on because, anyway. So Richard was happy because the whole time he was just not happy about being labeled a molester, quote unquote. Like he didn't want to be labeled that, just sickening, but he was happy about those charges being dropped. Now, Judge Nelson rules that there is sufficient evidence for trial. So basically, this little mini trial was just to confirm that there was evidence to go on to a main trial. And he also ruled that Richard would face the death penalty. There were 16 households in question, 14 murders, 5 attempted murders, 4 rapes, and then there were 3 acts of oral copulation, 4 acts of sodomy. So these were the charges. All of this being between June of 1984 to August of 1985. Richard's family, they are horrified, because they are just kind of finding out like all these details. Like they don't know, they're so in the dark about everything, but they are horrified to learn of these 58 counts. So yeah, it's just a lot. It's a lot for them to even wrap their heads around. May 21st, 1986. So after that hearing, Ramirez pleads not guilty. So he's moving forward with that. Now the case is moved now to a Judge Dion Morrow. Now Halpin, he's not happy about this because Morrow is just a super busy judge. He has a very busy schedule. Now the defense on their side, they keep filing postponements. And Morrow's like okay with this because he has a very busy schedule. So this is May. Jump to November 1986. So Halpin has had enough of the delays. So he asks for a different judge. He just basically asked for Judge Morrow to step down. So a new judge is put in place. It's a Judge Michael Tynan. So he is assigned. And Tynan is a very gentle judge, but a very hard-working, expeditious judge. Like he moves quickly. He is very calm and even-keeled and fair, but he moves. Like he doesn't do what Morrow does. Now he sets the trial for September. This is September 1987. We are almost, by then it will be 2 full years out from when Richard was caught. That actually comes and goes, and the Hernandez actually asked for more time. So Judge Tynan sets the trial for September 30 of 1987. So a full 2 years later. Now the Hernandez, they asked for 2 more months, and he concedes. And then they make more motions. So they go back and forth with some motions. The defense actually comes back and requests that Judge Tynan be removed based on racial bias. Now, this was kind of expected. So another judge has to come in who rules against this. So it takes a while. They go back and forth with these requests and with these things. And finally, a date is set, like a new date. So it went from being September of 87. Now the trial is set to begin July 21st of 1988. We're talking almost a full 3 years after Richard's arrest. By this time, Richard is very different, between the starchy food of the prison and not a lot of exercise. He has gained weight. He's filled out. He is reading a lot, and his demeanor has become more calm. He's become more focused. He does have a female friend. Her name is Eva, and she is writing to him. She is a Satanist as well. She visits and writes. He has gained all this confidence through all these lady friends and lady admirers. So he's got a lot of confidence. He's got a big ego from all the attention, and just more and more women are beginning to kind of get into his circle, and his visitation involves like a lot of lines. So the jail where he's been housed, this is like the county jail, like they have never experienced anything like this before. Like there are lines of women that just wait and wait and wait in lines for hours and hours just to be able to visit him. Now, that Doreen, she is constantly writing letters. She is talking to the press about Richard and his innocence, but she never actually meets with Richard until 1988. Like, she doesn't want to be a part of his groupie, like, people. Like, she doesn't want to be associated with any of those women. So she has not been in court at this time. She has not met with him or waited any lines until, like, right before actually he goes to court, actually. He does have another woman. He's going to have women in and out of this picture, but another woman named Amy. So she was always at court. She even had stickers made up professing her love for Richard, and she would wear them to court. And on top of all the women that are coming to court, his family is still coming. So Ruth, Reuben, Robert, they are visiting him this whole time. They are corresponding. They are coming to court. They are kind of going back and forth, but, being the correspondence between like Julian and him and Mercedes. So, because they're at home in El Paso, but yeah, and Julian in that 3 years has aged about 15. It's just the weight of everything going on. It's really aging him and Mercedes. Now, before the trial even begins, the state of California had already spent $1.3 million. And this is in the 80s. Now, jury selection, it starts on that July 21st of 88. And it starts with 1,600 citizens pooled. Richard, he appears in court. He's in a shirt, tie, and black leather jacket. And actually, the black leather jacket came from Doreen. So she is clothes, and she is there. So she shows up to court as well. Now, Richard, he absolutely hates going to court, period. And sometimes he's nodding off, like he's actually falling asleep in court. So he begins wearing large black sunglasses that Doreen buys him because he was getting in trouble by the judge for falling asleep. So now he's got these sunglasses and he's sleeping. Now, security was super tight around Richard, especially because he was talking, and he told the bailiff that he was going to have one of his groupies sneak a gun into the courthouse so that he could shoot Halpin and then shoot into the audience and then shoot himself. So security was super tight. The bailiffs are watching, Richard, and he is shackled. Now, everyone is being searched before they can even enter the courtroom, and Halpin was actually searched himself, and he got mad and had the judge, stop that because he didn't want the prospective jurors to see him getting searched. But everybody was getting searched. Jury selection, it took kind of 6 months, longer than expected. Okay? So it is starting on July 21st. The situation. So the jury is finally selected, and it goes through the whole end of the year. So the jury is sworn in and in place by January 10th of 99. Yes. And there were 6 Hispanic persons on the jury. There were 6 African Americans, which was exactly the route that the defense wanted to go. There were 7 females and 5 men. And then there were 12 alternates put in place. So they had 12 jurors and then 12 alternates. And they knew that it was going to be a long trial. Now, the Hernandez were thrilled by this jury. This was exactly the jury that they wanted. Now, Arturo wasn't really helping Daniel much. So Arturo and Daniel were showing up at first, and then Arturo kind of was over it. So, at this point, they are months in. They have been working on this case already, obviously, a lot. There were no book deals, no movie deals paying out. There was literally only one made-for-TV movie in the works at this point. And Daniel was super stressed, and he was, comforting himself with food, and he had a paralegal named Richard Salinas with him, and that's all he had. So he was showing up to court with just himself and a paralegal. I mean, this is a major defense. So now Arturo isn't even showing up with him, so he's getting no help. Now, the first day of the trial, the courtroom's packed. Of course, it's been packed. Richard is in a charcoal gray suit, courtesy of Doreen. Halpin opens with laying out the facts. He lays them out very calm, matter of fact. He states he would prove his case with surviving witnesses, glove prints, fingerprints, shoe prints, and he referenced the pentagram. As Halpin, he kind of systematically describes all 15 attacks in question. This was a first for people to hear the details. They hadn't heard these details. And there were just audible gasps, from the press, spectators, even the groupies. They had no idea of just the level. I mean, none of these details had come out in the press at this point. So they just didn't know. They had no clue what all the Night Stalker had done. Now, the evidence Halpin detailed was extensive to the red markings on the bullets, Richard's fingerprints, the Avia shoe prints, the handcuff key left for Carole King. It matched the same keys discovered at Ma Bell's home. So he is just laying this all out there. And the very first witness called was Jenny Vinkau's son, Jack. So her murder had absolutely devastated him. He had actually moved back to New York City, where he'd grown up, where he was from, and where Jenny was from. And he had, flown in just for the trial. Now, during cross-examination, Richard's in his sunglasses, and he literally is turning around in his seat and snarling at the press, so Hernandez, and this is in front of the jury. So Hernandez, he tries to approach Jack by kind of indicating that possibly Jenny's other son, Jack's brother, had killed Jenny, but Judge Tynan kind of slams him for, doing this. They had already gone through this. The prosecution had already laid out that his brother had a sound alibi. It had already been vetted. All of that had been discussed in retrial hearings and such. Now, later on, a jury would state they felt really bad for Jack and that Hernandez showed no respect at all to them. And literally, Hernandez just did not have the experience to be in court alone, talking to these witnesses. He just didn't have it. And it was very noticeable. Now, the most damning witness for the killing of Jenny was the fingerprint expert, Ronaldo Clara. Now, he discovered 5 fingerprints on Jenny's window screen that matched to Richard. Now, moving onward in witnesses, Halpin calls Maria Hernandez, who at the time of the trial, this is several years, all these people have moved on with their lives. So she is now married, and she is actually pregnant with her first child. Now, Maria has to describe finding Dale in her kitchen, and then Dale's sister is in the courtroom, and so jurors and everybody hears, the crying. Doreen, she is providing Richard with money, books, paper, stamps, everything that he needs. He goes to Doreen for. He had asked for her to get Ted Bundy's contact information so that he could write to him. He said he had questions for him. So, obviously Ted Bundy was on death row in Florida at this point. Jorge Gallegos, he takes the witness stand, and he is asked to identify who he saw the night Veronica Vu was killed. And Jorge asked if Richard would stand and remove his glasses. The judge asked for Richard to stand, and Richard just cursed and yelled no. So the press covers this defiant act, all of these things that Richard's doing. I mean, every day, court is in session, the press are there, and they're releasing everything that's coming out. Now, testimony went through, about Jenny. It went through Maria, Carol, Dale, Veronica's death, and then they move on to Maxine Zazara. Now, the jury is visibly shaken at the telling of Maxine's eyes being removed and the stab wounds that she sustained. So the court was actually in session on Valentine's Day of 89. And one alternate juror, she's going to come up quite a bit. So her name is Cynthia. She goes by Cindy Hayden. So kind of Frank and Gil had noticed Cynthia kind of making eyes at Richard. So like he already has his groupies, but now this is an alternate juror. So she is making eyes at him. On this day, she brings cupcakes saying I love you and had a bailiff give it to Richard and make sure that he knew who it was from. Yes, this is happening. On February 21st, the defense attorney, Daniel, who had been, he's showing signs of exhaustion. So he phones in to the judge. He just needs to take a week off per doctor's orders, is what he's telling the judge. Now, the jury and everyone, they're already about 7 weeks in or so, just on the trial. And they're all, they've just been given all these horrible crime scene photos to go through. And, they're glad for the break in this. Now, one juror would later state that trial and having to see this heinous just changed them all for life, just changed. Court was supposed to reconvene on February 27th. But Daniel was a no-show, and so he sends notice he would need 1 to 4 more weeks off to be treated for nervous exhaustion, high sugars, and high lipids, like high cholesterol. Evidently, Daniel had tried this before in other cases. So the judge decided to give him 1 more week, but then the judge required Daniel, Arturo, and then Daniel's doctor all had to be back in court. All of them. Now, the press is all over this. They're issuing out articles regarding Daniel's delaying of the trial by being so-called sick. Like, all of this is being covered. Now, Daniel tries more delays, but Judge Tynan orders him to be ready to proceed by March 6th. In that time, Daniel, knowing he needs help, so he brings on an actual professional and experienced attorney named Ray Clark. Now, Tynan, knowing it would cost the state much more for a mistrial on this thing, and having vetted Clark, he agrees, and the court agrees to pay Clark like a defense pay, because he is a very experienced, like he is an actual attorney and very experienced and very good at his job. So he's going to get the defense counsel pay of $100 a day. Now, kind of a little side note, and again, this is so fascinating to me that, it's like the 80s, but it's just very close. These people have been through like the Manson deal. So Leslie Van Houten, one of Manson's followers, she had a new attorney assigned to her, like her other attorney went out or got sick or something happened. And so she got a new attorney, and it ended up causing like a whole issue appeals process because this attorney wasn't present during the whole trial, her whole trial. So it was just a deal. So the judge remembered this issue. So the judge makes Clark, Ray Clark, state he understands that he has to read the transcripts and get caught up on his own time. And he is co-counsel. Like, he's not the main counsel, but he is co-counsel. So he agrees to this. But basically, Judge Tynan wanted to put this on record because this was an issue on Leslie Van Houten case. Okay, I thought that was interesting. Now, finally by March, the defense table is actually full and functional. So you actually have Daniel showing up, you have Arturo showing up, and you have, their paralegal, and you have Ray Clark, and you have an actual defense going on. Halpin calls pathologist Dr. Kogan, who outlines for the jury Maxine Zazara's awful injuries, like the 3 gunshot wounds, the 8 stab wounds. She had ligature marks around her neck, and the way the upper eyelids were cut away for removal of her eyes. The jury, hearing this, they are squirming, they are moving uneasily in the chairs, and Richard just sits there totally indifferent. He's still in his sunglasses. He has 0.00 expression on his face. And in fact, he is bored and probably sleeping, but he literally has his face resting like on his hand, like he's just totally checked out. And again, yeah, this is his presence. So next on the stand, Linda Doy, she takes the stand to describe all of her parents' belongings that the police had found seized at that Felipe's house where Richard had sold, the stolen goods to him. Now, prosecution moves on to the awful crimes of Mabel Bell and her sister Nettie. And as the police officer, James Old, speaks about the injuries of the two women, the jurors, again, you guys remember the heinous injuries. Ma and Nettie were beaten in the head. They weren't dead upon this scene. They actually lived through their injuries, but Ma did pass away, and their injuries were horrible. The jurors, again, they are squirming, and then some of the female jurors are crying. Like, they're crying in the jury box. And this won't be the end of that. It's just, they're having to hear these awful things. And again, Richard's just sitting there like, absolutely. Now, a Dr. Claire Neebe, so she was the surgeon who actually worked on Nettie. So she is called to the stand, and she has to outline for the jury the physical evidence that 84-year-old Nettie was raped. And the courtroom is just in a stunned silence during this testimony, like tons. The jurors also have to, it's put into evidence. There are 51 graphic crime scene photos from Ma's house, from Ma and Nettie's injuries, that they have to look over. Now, moving to the rape and assault of Carol. So this is Carol Kyle. She takes the stand, defiantly staring at Richard, and he laughs at her. He just lets out a laugh whenever he sees her. And the women in the courtroom, even Richard's groupies, they just go blank as Carol describes the details of being sexually assaulted by Richard, by the Night Stalker, so to speak, Richard. Mary Cannon's murders, the prosecution and the defense, they fight over what pictures to show of Mary's gashes. So the prosecution wants Mary's, gashes. She was gashed and stabbed very badly. He wants these pictures looked at because he's tying it together with the same type of injuries as Jenny Bencow. And of course, the defense is saying that these are awful, they don't, prejudicial or whatever. So Judge Tynan agrees with prosecution, stating the autopsy photos needed to reflect because they had similar MO patterns. And so the jury has to see them. Now, moving forward, Whitney Bennett, remember, she was the 16-year-old that Richard attacked brutally, and she didn't even realize how bad she was injured. She's like 20 by now, but she is called as a witness, and she has had to have 4 operations to repair and remove damage caused by him. Now, on the stand, again, she's now 20 years old, and she describes her injuries and her continuous medical procedures that she's had. She even has, her left eye socket had been smashed in, guys. And she still had impairments from this. She still, was under the care of, surgeons, cosmetic surgeons, all kinds of doctors. And she had impairment. She had vision problems. Whitney's father, Steve, was called as well. And jury number 11, her name was Maria. So she actually sends a note to the judge that she works for the same company as Steve. He was an executive in the company that she worked for, actually. So the judge calls her to meet with him and all the attorneys. And so she, says she had seen Steve in the company cafeteria. She knew who he was, but she had never spoken to him before. He wasn't her direct boss or anything like that. Now, all the attorneys were fine with keeping her on the jury. However, once Richard found out, he wanted her gone because he was like, no, this guy is, an executive or quote unquote boss at her company. Like he just wanted her gone. Now, prosecution conceded because they don't want any grounds for an appeal. The judge doesn't want a ground for an appeal. So Maria is removed from the jury, and then she was replaced by an alternative named Donald McGee. Richard, he is wanting jurors replaced, of course, because he sees Cindy, who's in love with him, as an alternate juror. He wants Cindy on his jury, basically. That's what he's after. Prosecution keeps working their way through just each event. The defense is not having a whole lot to say about anything. Some of these witnesses get on the stand and it would be more prejudicial to the defense to keep them on the stand. These were heinous acts, and there's really nothing for the defense to add. Now, the defense does make some progress when Sophie Dickman is called in her rape. So as far as undermining her and her description of Richard, so they make some movement on that. Now, on the death of Shanarong Kabanovich, so his surviving wife, Samkid, she testifies. She has to describe, her husband being shot. She has to describe her own beating and rape. And then Samkid's emotional testimony, very emotional. She is absolutely devastated. So not only women in the audience, but seasoned reporters were crying, jurors were crying, even men in the jury were tearing up. So her testimony is absolutely, heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching. Gil was in the courtroom. He's there every day, but he stated, which, Gil had worked 300 homicides even before this whole thing started, but he said, seeing her testify was one of the saddest things I've ever been exposed to in the courtroom. It's just sad. So her sobs were heartbreaking. So when she was asked to identify her attacker, she points at Richard and he just laughs and she cries harder. So, this is what he is portraying to the jury. Yeah, he just laughed at her tears and everything that she was saying. A few days later, Sakina Abuith, she has to testify. And just like Samkid, her husband is killed. She doesn't even realize he's killed. She was beside herself, and she has to describe her own rape and beating. And her testimony broke even Judge Tynan. So the judge is now tearing up. So after these women get up there and, have to detail just all these awful details, the judge broke. So after her testimony, the judge, says to her, "We are so sorry for your loss and God bless you," which she returned with, "I hope you do good judgment." So it's just absolutely heartbreaking, these survivors. So prosecution, they go through with the events. They do call Jesse Perez. Remember Jesse Perez? And then all the people who knew Richard as far as living in the downtown area, being burglars and such. So they're identifying him as, having bad teeth, going by Richard, different names. He wears all black. They know him to be, a burglar. Halpin calls Donna Meyer and Earl Gregg. Now, they both are related to knowing Richard and how he sells items. Donna was the one that kind of knew him, had stashed money, had put money aside, had held money for him. So they are called and they testify. Then after that, all the individuals involved with Richard's capture are called to testify. So all the people on Hubbard Avenue on the 31st of August. Now, the LA police officer, Kaiser, he discusses Richard's telling of his, black bag at the Greyhound terminal. And then how Richard said, "Why don't you just shoot me? I want to die. Now they're going to send me to the electric chair." So the defense tried to counter this Officer Kaiser, as Richard had told the defense he never said that to the police about the bag, but Kaiser was unshakable, so the defense did not have any ground there. Now, Halpin then calls an LAPD Sergeant George Thomas, who was actually on the task force, for the Night Stalker, and he had placed Richard in an interview room whenever Richard was arrested. So Thomas was able to testify how he didn't, Mirandize Richard because he didn't ask him any questions. However, Richard started talking to him, and he said a lot of things, and he was, Richard was singing, talking, and how Richard stated, "Of course I did it. You know that I'm a killer." And then said to Thomas, "Can you imagine the people caught me and not the police?" So he was able to testify on Richard's words. Now, little side note about Richard's, just something weird that happened. So Richard always had a notepad in court. Well, Richard evidently put some tin foil on the back of the notepad to use it as a mirror. So now Richard is using the foil, the back of the notepad, to reflect light from the ceiling into, the judge's eyes, into the witness's eyes. So this is going on during court, and the judge is irritated big time. And he's telling him to stop that. Now, Richard is doing this foil bit, and Halpin calls Felipe Solano. Now, Felipe was asked if he purchased stolen goods from others, other people other than just Richard. Felipe says no, to which Richard screams out, "Liar." Then the bailiffs close in on Richard, and the reporters are just, scribbling everything down because they're going to, put this in the papers. But everything settles down. The testimony continues, but Richard continues his stunt with the foil and the light. And at the end of that day, when the jurors were dismissed, the judge had the bailiff take away the foil, remove it from Richard. So the judge is having to, it's basically acting like a 5-year-old. Now, prosecution, they go through calling all the experts related to the Avia shoe, and they call the doctor who took Richard's teeth impressions and x-rays. So they're getting all of the experts up there at this point. Now, the prosecution rests in April, and they call in the guards at the jail that testified about Richard's drawing pentagrams in his own blood in his jail cell, which matched up with the pentagrams at the crime scenes. So the defense at this point, this is April, they asked for 2 weeks to prepare. So court is set to resume May 1st. Okay. So now Richard is still telling his attorneys he does not want a defense at all. Clark, he wants to go the insanity route, and he tries to get Ruth to, talk Richard into this and to help him talk him into this. Now, Richard refuses to even, think about an insanity plea. He does not, because of his own pride, basically, he refuses to say that he's insane or anything like that. Now, court is back in session May 1st. Now, the prosecution, they asked the judge, this is kind of weird, but they asked the judge that they want to reopen their case just to re-question Felipe, who hadn't been 100% honest. So they called Felipe, and he conceded he had actually purchased stolen goods from, other people. And there was one particular woman that he purchased from, but he didn't want to state that he purchased from her. He didn't want to get her in trouble because she was a mother. That's what he states. Now, defense cross-examines Felipe, and then they try to go talk to Richard again about his defense. So they're kind of in a little recess after this. Now, Richard is screaming at his attorneys about not wanting a defense and that the trial was a joke. He doesn't want a defense. Now, Clark goes and talks to the judge about everything, and they agreed for the defense to take a minute and talk to Richard's family, and that would take the rest of the week. So basically they come in to do that one 10-minute session with Felipe, and then they're out the rest of the week. After a lot of back and forth, Richard asked to speak to the doctor, Demetrius, who had actually helped the defense with jury selection, and he had kind of trusted her. And she advises Richard to allow the defense to proceed and to call Julian to testify. So Julian had come forward to Clark and said that Richard was in El Paso during, like May of 85 during the Ma Bell Carol Kyle event, so that he couldn't have done, what they said he did on, May 30th. Now, Richard concedes after talking, to the doctor. So now Daniel can actually have a defense. So Daniel begins with the defense opening statements. Now, the defense does make some ground regarding the witness statements around Veronica Vu, and the defense does call Julian. Julian testifies that Richard was in El Paso beginning May 23rd of 85 and stayed for 8 days, which would put him, out of town, during the Ma Bell Nettie Carroll event, which happened like on the 31st. Prosecution requested to recall Julian once they looked further into it, because prosecution felt like Julian was lying or mistaken on that fact. But anyway, we'll get back to that. Now, Julian is recalled again and asks more details about this visit. Now, Julian says Richard was home for Ruth's daughter's Gloria's communion, which was on May 25th of 1985. And prosecution is just asking more details, and that's what they ask. Now, Halpin agrees to let Julian go, but he's going to be subject to a third recall if prosecution wants it. Now, the whole time Julian was on the stand, Richard never looked at his dad, and he had threatened, for the court not to allow the press to take photos, because the press they were allowed to take photos evidently of like in the courtroom at this time, and he was not happy. Evidently his dad had already been put in the paper like the first time he was on the stand, and so Richard, stated he did not want his dad involved. Like, Richard absolutely hated his family having to be involved. That was the only remorse Richard had at all, was related to, his parents and Ruth. The defense calls the original defense attorney, Alan Adishak. Now, one juror named Fernando, so he comes forward at this point because he went to school with Alan. So Richard was asked, and he wanted Fernando gone. And again, he wants Cindy in place. So he's ecstatic that a juror is gone. So Fernando is dismissed. So they they draw straws. Basically, they put the numbers in the basket or their names in a basket. And so the alternative that was drawn was Cindy. So when she finds out that she's going to be juror number 1 in Fernando's place, she smiles like she won a prize. Like, she is ecstatic. Now, the defense calls a Judy Crawford, who was in the public defender's office and present at the time of the lineup that happened. So they're trying to prove that the lineup that happened, that there was a lot of police. She's trying to say that the police were holding up like 2 fingers to indicate to the victims to choose Richard. So basically they're calling her up to kind of counter that the lineup should never have happened, quote unquote. So that's why she was on the stand. Now, a little bitty side note. So during this time, the actor Sean Penn, if anyone knows who that is, and I didn't forget him, but I forgot this whole situation. So Sean Penn is literally in the county jail. He had punched a photographer, so he's in jail for 32 days. Now, to keep him apart from other people, to keep him safe, they have to put him in like the type of cell that Richard's in. So he is put right beside Richard's cell. Now, at this point, Sean Penn was married to Madonna. I had totally forgotten this. The whole 80s of this all. So Madonna comes to visit Sean, and she finds out that Ramirez, the quote-unquote Night Stalker's next door, and she's like, she wants to meet him, and Sean Penn's like, no, you're not meeting him. And Richard had sent a note to Sean because he wanted his autograph. And then, so he asked for Sean's autograph, and Sean writes him a little note that says something like, I've formed a kindred spirit with these, people since I've been in custody, but I do not have a kindred spirit with you, Richard Ramirez. Like he just says something like that. So that's a little side note. So Sandra is called to the stand. So she is the one that was evidently set up to be by the cops, like used her to get to Felipe. Remember? So Sandra gets on the stand and talks about how she had partnered with Ramirez. And so she basically goes through this whole thing that she worked with Ramirez, but that he was very messy burglar and that he burglared during the day. So kind of offsetting or trying to offset the defenses, like, Ramirez being very good at burglary, being very swift and fast and all this. So kind of making it seem like he was maybe not very smart and didn't work very well at burglary. So anyway, Ramirez would later say he absolutely did not know her, but she went on stand she wasn't a very believable witness, but yeah, because she was like a jailhouse snitch or whatever that the police had used to, get her in with Felipe. So anyway, whatever she said didn't go very far, but she did discuss that. Also, just a little side note, there was a Zena LaVey, of course, that Anton LaVey, the Church of Satan, his daughter. So one day in July, she comes into court to support Richard, and she brings like 5 other Church of Satan members, and they all come to court to show their support for Richard, kind of sit right behind him. Now, the jurors will later comment about being very concerned about their safety and thinking, they go back to the Manson followers and all the stunts that happen, and they were scared. They were like looking at these, Satan worshipers as scary, very scary. So the defense rested, and then prosecution recalls some witnesses. So Halpin calls Dr. Lung, who was the dentist who worked on Richard. Now, he was able to confirm Richard was in his LA office March 8th, May 17th, May 21st, May 23rd, and May 30th. So kind of dispelling Julian's testimony a bit of the dates of Richard being in El Paso. Now, the defense calls a Dave Hancock of the El Paso News. And I don't even understand why, because I'll just tell you. So all Dave gets up on stand and states was that he interviewed Julian August 31st of 85 when Richard was arrested. And Julian told Dave Richard hadn't been home for 2 to 3 years. So upon this testimony, which again, the defense had called, the defense asked for a break, and they want to get witnesses to confirm Julian's testimony. So the judge allows this. Now, I will say the judge allows a lot. None of these people, the judge, Halpin, none of these people want a mistrial. They don't want an appeal. They are pretty much going along with whatever the defense requests, especially time-wise or whatever they're going to allow. So the judge allows it, and Halpin's like pointing out Dr. Lung's testimony and his charts of when Richard was in the dental office. So, Halpin's trying to be like, hey, like he wasn't there. So, or he was home, at least to prove, hey, if you're trying to prove that Richard was gone on the 30th and 31st of May, you can't, because the dental, records show that he was home in LA. Now, the defense calls, so they get back together, they go hunt down. They call a friend of Julian's who had come by Julian's house on May 25th and stated he saw Richard. So they fly this guy in. He says he saw Richard. And then also a woman named Maria, who was married to Joseph at the time. So she comes in, and she's going to be the final witness. So she testifies that Richard was in El Paso on the 25th. But additionally, Maria does also say that he left the 29th. So again, kind of going back to Dr. Lung's testimony that Richard was, in fact, in LA the 30th. And then, of course, the events of Ma, Nettie, and Carol all happened the 30th and 31st. So on July 21st, finally, we're talking this began January, so the actual trial part with jurors in place. So on July 21st, after a 4-day summation, Halpin is finished. He had called in total 139 witnesses. He had entered 537 pieces of evidence. And he called Richard a methodical killing machine. The defense summarized. The judge then goes through his part of telling jury how to go about each count, which took 2 days just for the judge to discuss how they go about their verdicts, how they go about the counts, just to outline all that to the juries. Now, on July 26th at 11:25, they began deliberations. And after a few days of complaints, juror number 4 is actually replaced because he keeps falling asleep. So because they kept going around the table, they're having to go count by count and figure out. So juror number 4 was just not paying attention. So the judge had to replace him. So he is gone. So we literally have 3 alternates that have been put in. Now, August 14th, a juror named Phyllis Singletary, so she doesn't show up. And come to find out, she was murdered. So she had been shot, and the judge met with the rest of the jury because at first, when they were just finding out details, they didn't know what happened to her. They didn't know if this was related to the case, if this was retaliation. The jurors were scared. So the judge meets with the jury to comfort and assure them that her death was not related to the case. In fact, she was killed by her boyfriend. And evidently he had been abusive or whatever. Now, her replacement was a woman named Mary. So when Mary finds out, she is, visibly upset and crying. And later it was learned that Mary had lost 2 brothers in law enforcement who had been shot to death. And evidently she had not maybe claimed this or stated this to anybody, but she had that trauma going on. So she was very upset. During this time of the jury deliberation, Richard is cursing. He is not wanting to be there. The judge doesn't know what to do with him. So they pretty much have to just allow for Richard to be in a little, his holding cell, but so that he can hear court procedures, but he's not in the court because he is refusing to go to court. He's refusing. And then Arturo, by this time, is not showing up. So he is contempt of the court. And he was supposed to be calling in to let the judge know where he was and such. He wasn't even calling in. So he's held in contempt. At 10:50 a.m. on September 20th, the jury finally announces that they have the unanimous decision. So they began deliberating July 26th. It is now September 20th. So at 2:30, with a courtroom packed, Richard refused to be in the room, so he is not in the room. The judge announced that beginning with the Jeannie Vincal's murder, he is guilty, and he is found guilty, unanimously guilty, on all 46 charges. So sentencing is scheduled for September 29th, and the press were all over this. The Ramirez family and Doreen are absolutely devastated. Doreen had run out of the courtroom whenever this was announced, but many people were cheering, crying. Obviously this was very emotional. Now, at sentencing, the defense did not have any rebuttal. So Richard had refused for anyone to speak on his behalf. He didn't want to speak on his behalf. Halpin, when he spoke, he was, emotionally implored the jury for justice. And he stated if the death penalty was ever warranted, it was this case, and reminded them all of the atrocities committed. Now, Ray Clark did speak to the jury, on Richard's behalf about mercy and, Richard's father's love for him and just have mercy on Richard. On October 3rd, the jury told the court they decided on the penalty of death. So they did come back penalty of death. Now, Richard does have words that he says upon understanding that he has been sentenced to death. He states, "You don't understand me. You are not expected to. You are not capable. I am beyond your experience. I am beyond good and evil. I will be avenged. Lucifer dwells in all of us. I don't know why I'm even wasting my breath, but what the hell? For what is said of my life, there have been lies in the past and there will be lies in the future. I don't believe in the hypocritical, moralistic dogma of this so-called civilized society. I need not look beyond this courtroom to see all the liars, the haters, the killers, the crooks, the paranoid cowards. You maggots make me sick, hypocrites one and all. We are all expendable for a cause. No one knows that better than those who kill for policy, clandestinely or openly, as do the governments of the world which kill in the name of God and country. I don't need to hear all of society's rationalizations. I've heard them all before. Legions of the night, night breed, repeat not the errors of the night prowler and show no. So these are Richard's words. Other people are able, many people are able to get up and speak on behalf of their loved ones and, talk about their families. And so many people get up and, Virginia Peterson gets up and goes through all of, the horrendous, things that the physical things that she's been through. There have been 4 years since the attempted murder of her husband. And then, of course, her child was there. So there are a lot of impassioned, or I should say passionate pleas, of the victims and then their families. And then about, just definitely, like Joyce Nelson's son gets up and talks about how his mom was about to retire, and that was stolen from her and from him and just her life. So it's just absolutely, heart-wrenching. And there are tears in the judge's eyes to hear, the victims and their families. So I think it's wonderful that the victims and their families are able to get up and have a voice in the courtroom when their family was not given that opportunity. Trial is over. Richard is still at the county jail at this point. He has not been transferred quite yet. Now, Frank and Gil, they are utterly relieved this is over. They have been wanting to talk to Richard. And so they immediately set up an appointment with Richard at the jail. And so they are able to talk to him and get with him and just ask him questions and such. And so they do now, and they do ask him, they're wanting him to talk. So, they're being very, kind to him. They're like, well, what do you, like? And blah, blah, blah. What do you need? And so he tells them chocolate. Okay. So he wants chocolate. That's the only thing that he can think of. Now, at this time, right after the trial, there is an NBC, made for TV movie coming out called Manhunt. And it is dropping. They go see him and it's dropping that night. So it comes out and Richard is actually going to get to watch it. Gil watched it. Frank did not watch it. Frank's wife taped it for him or whatever. Gil had his whole family together and they all watched it. And Gil is just very proud of just the whole, that he was a part of not excited about the killings or anything like that, but just proud to be a part of just capturing, this killer. And just, it was a fine moment for him or whatever. So the movie comes out. Richard had actually, that day before the movie, he had gone into the showers and had gotten in trouble. Basically, he had tried to pry open this vent and get out or whatever. So he was in trouble. He didn't actually get to watch the made-for-TV movie. So they show up the next day, Frank and Gil show up, and they bring the movie. They bring snacks. They're able to watch it. They laugh about, the way they're portrayed, because there's actors, of course, playing Richard and playing Gil and whatever. And they talk about how the actor playing Gil is not, he's too skinny. So they just, anyway, so that kind of, I don't know. It's hard to imagine being in that situation and talking to him and knowing what he did, and of course, but the police have a job to do, and they're just trying to get his trust and get him talking, just make sure that they get everything they can out of him. Now, right after this, the jurors have become family with each other. They actually have like a party together, and then Cindy and a couple of the other jurors, they go on to do interviews, and we see that still today, how jurors will finish with the trial and they'll go, they'll both speak about it and such. But Cindy talks in interviews about how the defense did a poor job. So she just discusses that. So on November 16th, Richard is moved to San Quentin. And just a little bit about San Quentin. It was built in 1852. It's 30 miles or so from the Golden Gate Bridge. There had been 409 people hung at San Quentin until 1938, when they removed the gallows and put in a gas chamber at that point. So it is the place that they take people to be on death row. Now, they literally bring Richard in to San Quentin by helicopter. Now, Richard, this whole time afterwards, he is saying that he does not want to appeal the case. He does not want to go through appeal. He didn't even want to go through the first trial. Now, Richard is still facing the actual murder charge of the Pans in San Francisco. And in February of 1990, so he is transferred to the San Francisco County Jail. And he actually likes the county jail better than San Quentin. Now, this is 90. So fast forward, he is just literally sitting in that jail. Now, in August of 1993, Frank retires. So he is having heart palpitations. Come to find out, he is having heart issues, high blood pressure. Like, he is not in a good way, health-wise. So he has to take time off, and he has to retire. Now, remember Whitney, the victim. So she had actually, kind of formed a relationship with Frank. Not a relationship, but he just took to her. He felt for her and just really, I don't know what the word was, proud of her and how she had bounced back from this horrible thing or whatever. And so she actually, her and her family came to Frank's retirement party. And so Frank's son was there. Remember Mike? So he was actually, part of the sheriff's department too. So Mike and her begin to date, and they actually end up getting married. Just a little thing. And Gil actually said that was the one good thing to come of, the Night Stalker, was that union. So in September of 1993, so Richard this whole time has been at the San Francisco County Jail. Now, he has moved back to San Quentin for security reasons, mainly all the girls. So during this whole time, so Cindy has formed a relationship with him. She has become a private investigator. She is now working with attorneys. He does have new defense attorneys that are, helping him. They were helping him as far as on the Pan deal, and they were helping him as far as appeals. So she's involved. He has Doreen involved. She is talking to talk shows. And in fact, Cindy has gone to Donahue and Sally Jesse Raphael. And so she's around, and not only her and Doreen, but then you have all these other women. So the San Francisco County Jail, they didn't want to deal with this anymore. So they had Richard since February of 1990. So they're done with him. They're okay, this has been not fun. And the deal was, so on the Pan deal, the state of California was going to try him on the Pans. Well, then his defense attorneys came back and were okay, well, if you try him, he's going to plead the insanity plea this time. And they were working on appeals for the other deal. And so the San Francisco County, they just came back and said, okay, if by chance an appeal happens or his conviction is overturned in LA County, that's when we're going to come back and file charges. So basically his charges were dropped on the Pans just because he has the death penalty, but they were going to reinstate them if those dropped for any reason. I mean, they wanted to keep him locked up. As long as he was locked up, the state of California was not going to put him on any more trials, if that makes sense. And of course, yeah. So he still has, again, just all these girls. So during this time, during actually the time early on, so Julian does die in August of 1991 of bone cancer. So he actually passed 91. Now that Mike, remember awful cousin Mike, he actually has a heart attack and dies in April of 1995. And the family, even to that time, still did not know how much Mike had shared with Richard and that Richard had watched Jesse be killed. Now, in June of 1996, so this is kind of weird, but at the San Quentin prison, you're in an adjustment, quote unquote, period for at minimum like 6 months, but it can go longer. Well, because Richard had kind of been in and out, because he had been at the San Francisco jail, like he is finally out of the adjustment in June of 1996. Well, the adjustment basically, like he didn't have set visitation hours. Like when Doreen had to come visit him, she had to like wait in line for hours and hours and maybe would see him. So basically he's transferred in June of 1996, he's transferred to the official death row. So now he has like normal visiting hours. Like it's like 8 to 2, 3 or 4 days a week. So he actually has set visiting contact hours. And he had promised Doreen that he would marry her once he got out of the quote unquote adjustments. So they set a date. So evidently every 4 months, the prison has like a marriage ceremony date that you can apply for. Okay. So he applies for it. Richard applies for it. He tells Doreen he's applied for it. So they set their wedding date as October 3rd, 1996. So he actually marries Doreen. Richard marries Doreen on that date. Ruth is there. Joseph is there. I believe Joseph's daughter. So he has a niece there. Anyway, he has family there. And that happens in 96. Now, Doreen eventually separates. She stays with Richard the whole time. And during this whole time, he has attorneys working on his case this entire time, okay? From pretty much like the 90s on. He is back and forth in courts. He's back and forth with attorneys. He's with Doreen. It just keeps going on and on and on. Now, in 2009, I will say this. In 2006, his final appeal at the California Supreme Court is finally like upheld. So basically, his appeal is stricken. His conviction is upheld. Like it took that many years, but in 2006, like the California Supreme Court comes back and says, okay, we're done. Your appeals are done. Your conviction stands, like in LA County, like you are convicted. So that is done in 2006. Now in 2009, DNA evidence comes forward about another, that ties Richard to another death. So on April 10th of 1984, Richard, committed a murder. And again, they don't find this out until 2009. So this was literally a little girl, 9 years old. Her name is Mei Ling. She goes by Linda. And this was in San Francisco. She was raped, beaten, and stabbed to death. And she was left hanging over a pipe in the basement of her apartment building located in San Francisco. And again, nothing had tied her to this. Like they didn't know about this. This wasn't something that he was like convicted of. And DNA evidence that they had, his profile, that all was matched up. Yes. So that was officially his first murder in that time frame, really, because that was April of 1984. And I'm sure, let's be honest, there was probably several more. There were at least 2 other suspected incidences. Plus, like we mentioned, there was an Anastasia who was an abducted child that was, molested by Richard, and those charges were dropped. There was a Patty Higgins who was murdered in June of 85 in Arcadia, and she was heinously murdered just like the others. There just wasn't enough physical evidence, so those charges were dropped. And also there was a Christina and Mary Caldwell who were, sisters that lived together that were viciously killed around that same time frame. And that Richard actually bragged about killing. Like while he was in jail, he bragged about killing. So these were definitely other murders that Richard was tied to, and probably even more, assaults and such that just were never known, Now, right at 2009, whenever, they're finding out about Linda Ling, so Doreen separates from Richard. So she leaves Richard in 2009, right when that happens. Now, they never legally divorce, but yeah. Also in 2009, Richard is diagnosed with B-cell lymphoma. So he already had health issues going on at this point from having hepatitis C from intravenous drug use. And evidently he was still evidently getting drugs in jail, even and shooting up and stuff in jail. So he was still using at that time in jail. Now, eventually, Richard's, health is failing. His liver fails, and they say he literally turns green, but he passes away June 7th, 2013, and he is 53 years old. Many of his victims, celebrate his passing. A lot of people were very upset that he wasn't, put to death by the state or whatever. And obviously we've gone into it, but so many suffered physical and mental anguish. So many of the survivors had physical, issues their entire life from everything that he had done to them. So just to kind of round things out. So Prosecutor Halpin, he had actually passed away in 2003 at the age of 65 of cancer. Now, Mercedes, Julian had passed away in 91. Mercedes lives to be 89 years old. She passes away in 2016. So she actually outlived Richard. And it doesn't say, I could not find any information on if Richard's family is still living or whatever. It did mention that Ruth, never had remarried, had moved in with her mom, kind of taking care of her kids and such. So, of course, Gil and Frank are still alive and, doing Netflix documentaries, which are very interesting. I did not use any of that for research. My research is posted in my show notes, and the book was a big research item, and the book was written in 1996. So a lot of research I had to do after the fact or beyond, the book or whatever. But biggest thing is, this was heinous. This was awful. A lot of people, after all this, I don't understand Richard. I don't understand his motivation. I don't know if he ever turned away from this Church of Satan. I couldn't find anything like that. Evidently, Doreen, whenever he died, she was not around. They were not legally divorced, but allegedly he was already supposedly engaged to some 23-year-old woman whenever he died in 2013. And I'm sure, as you can see from the whole time, he had multiple relationships with women, at least, through correspondence. He definitely had a plethora of women writing to him and this and that. There was just always so many women, wanting to see him, wanting to meet him, which blows my mind. I don't understand it. I personally don't understand it. I understand the psychology that they mention, the quote unquote bad boy or whatever. And a lot of these women, I guess, told themselves that, oh, he didn't do it, whatever. But, yeah, because even Cindy, who was the alternate juror that became the juror, she convicted him. sentence him. And then she went on to have a full-blown relationship with him for many years after the fact, by the way. So a very close relationship like Doreen had with him. So yeah, I don't understand. And obviously she knew and thought he killed everyone, Yeah. So the basic thing for me is remembering just all of the victims surviving and the ones killed. And there's just so many, Linda, Jenny, Maria, Dale, Veronica, Vincent, Maxine, Bill, Lillian, Carol, Mabel, Nettie, Mary, Whitney, Joyce, Sophie, Leela, Maxon, Chonarong, Somkid, Chris, Virginia, Sakina, Ilias, Bill, Inez, Peter, and Barbara. And these are just, again, the ones we know of. And of course, we spoke of others. So thank you for listening. This was a lot. And I'm going to put this to bed. And I'm really excited about the upcoming episodes. I'm going to cover Amityville. I am going to dive into the DeFeo murder case, but also the Lutz hauntings. So there's going to be like 2 different episodes on it. I'm coming up to my 100th episode. Amber's going to be with me for the Lutz hauntings part, and that will be the big 100. So putting this Ramirez to bed. Please leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. Yeah. So love you guys. Hug your family, friends. Bye.